Today we're going to look at what needs to be disconnected when pulling the engine out of a Lamborghini Murcielago and some tips and tricks along the way. Hello and welcome back to the garage. Today the engine goes back in the Lamborghini Murcielago, but before we do that, we're going to look at what's involved in taking the engine out. What are the things that we need to disconnect? A few tips and tricks along the way. The very first thing we're going to discuss is whether or not you should pull out the drivetrain completely or just the engine. Now, unlike some of the earlier Lamborghini models, on the Murcielago, the engine can be removed by itself. You do not need to pull the transmission out. That said, having done it both ways now, experience has taught me that pulling out the drivetrain as a whole is actually a much easier exercise. So let's look at what's involved in getting the engine out only. What needs to be separated? If you're doing that, you need to disconnect the bell housing bolts that go between the transmission and the engine. That can be done in the car, but the access on it is very, very poor. In addition, splitting the engine from the gearbox is not terribly difficult. However, putting it back together can be, because not only do you have to line up the input shaft of the engine, you also have to line up the input shaft of the drive line that goes back to the rear differential, and that can be a little bit tricky. Reconnecting it out of the car was a bit of a pain. Now, you really want to make this decision at the beginning, whether you're going to take out just the engine or if you're going to take out the engine and the transmission. Because as I learned, if you take the engine out first and then you try to remove the transmission later, it is incredibly cumbersome and difficult to pull the transmission out. This is a really, really heavy gearbox. It can only come out in one orientation, and it is not an easy thing to wield around, even with the help of two people and a forklift. So again, you want to make that decision straight away as to what it is you want to do. Do you take out the two of them together or just one? Having spoken to a number of senior Lamborghini techs, they've all told me that taking out the drivetrain together is the way to do it. And from my personal experience, having done it both ways, I'm now very confident that this is the way that I would do it.
Do it. Do it.
Now let's walk around the engine and determine what needs to get taken out from around it. I will preface this by saying that this is not a super advanced procedure, but you do have to be really comfortable with tools and working around a car to do it. So this is not going to be a step-by-step guide. It's just going to give you the basic broad strokes of what needs to be disconnected, and at the same time cover some tips and tricks that I learned along the way. So let's have a look at the back side of the motor over here. Looking at the back side of the motor, one of the first things you're going to disconnect are the two big hoses that go to the thermostat housing and the water pump. Now those hoses will travel all the way back and connect to the radiators. You want to drain the cooling system and pull all of those hoses, including the hard lines that go back to the radiator, out. In addition, there's a multitude of wires that need to get disconnected. You're going to see some solenoids on the top here where the cam covers are. There's some more connectors up here. Really just kind of scope the engine around. It'll be pretty straightforward, and most of the connectors can only go in one location. Again, another one over here. This one I had to label A and B because I really wasn't sure which was which, and it was the only connector group that I thought could get mixed up. Otherwise, I thought that all the other ones were pretty straightforward. Again, a couple of sensors up here. Nothing major, nothing difficult, and the access is quite good. In addition, you're going to want to disconnect the hoses that go to the power steering pump. Also drain the AC system and disconnect the hoses that go to that. And on the alternator over here, you'll want to disconnect the wires that go to it. And there's a cover with a ducting that also needs to be removed as well. That gets installed afterwards because you need to have access to put the cables back on. The exhaust system should be removed all the way back. Now, it doesn't have to be removed. When Lamborghini put these engines in at the factory, they did do it with the complete exhaust system shy of the final tips, but it does make the assembly significantly bigger and more cumbersome, and for the ease of removing the exhaust system, I would just disconnect it. So we have one here, just have them covered up with rags at the moment. And then beyond that, on the back side of the engine, there's a very large mount over here And that mount, we'll walk over to the chassis right now and have a look. So if we look inside the car, that mount connects down here, and you'll want to disconnect the mount, but also disassemble it. It's made up of two parts, and then to disassemble it, you're also going to disconnect the handbrake assembly, because the handbrake assembly passes through the mounts. Over here, you're going to see the drive cups that go to the drive shafts. One little trick that we did along the way is, because we had to roll this car around while we were waiting to do the service, we hung the drive shafts using some zip ties, and that allowed them to be well supported and spin freely without flopping around and getting caught up in anything if the car was being rolled on its wheels. And then here you can also see the air conditioning lines as well. Now, just looking again at the drive cups, we'll go back to the engine, and you'll see the drive cups are right over here underneath these covers. Again, fairly straightforward to disconnect, nothing too hard. So that basically covers the back side of the engine. As I'm looking, I also noticed that, of course, these sensors that go, these temperature probes that go into the catalytic converters need to be disconnected as well. But that pretty well covers what you need to take off on the back. Now let's turn our attention to the driver's side, at least in North America, so the left side of the engine. Of course, the hoses leading to the throttle bodies need to be disconnected. And I would personally recommend removing the air boxes completely in the car. It gives a lot more access, and there's only a few screws to do. Looking again in here, there are a number of small vacuum lines that need to be disconnected. Nothing major, but something you need to be aware of. And the engine on the very front side of the cam cover has a group of bolts here that hold a whole assortment of ground connections. Those just need to be disconnected and pulled away. You'll also notice when we walk around the engine, there's little pieces of green tape on a few places here or there. This is a good example right here. And that's a little thing that we do in our shop over here, is that whenever a bolt is left loose for whatever reason, it absolutely, without any doubt, gets a piece of tape on it. Normally we have this green tape available. And that way it's an immediate visual reference that something is left loose. You will never, ever, ever remember. As much as you tell yourself, oh yeah, I'm going to remember later, you won't. So this way, it's a foolproof way of making sure that no bolts are ever left loose. Again, going back to this side of the engine, some of the things that you'll need to disconnect is you're going to disconnect this harness as well. Very, very large harness that goes to the side of the end of the car. We'll actually go look to where it is at the moment. And then over here, we have another big harness. This one I just have it sitting on the top of the engine, but again, this one loops around and back and goes right into the car. So let's have a look at where those live. So coming back to the car over here, side panels have all been removed, and you can see that yellow connection right there is where one of them goes, and on the other side is another one. And that's a large connector that takes care of most of the wires that go on the left side, actually most of the injection wires on the engine. Again, looking on this side of the engine, another consideration as well is if you're pulling the engine and gearbox together, this is one of those situations where there is an additional thing that you need to disconnect, and that is, this is the clutch line that goes to the slave cylinder. This is a manual transmission. I can't exactly claim how it is on an e-gear car, but you can disconnect it here, or the line continues back to the chassis and there's a place to disconnect it, but I find it easier to do it over here. And beyond that, there's also a single connector down here to take off. And that essentially covers the driver's side of the motor. Now, onto the passenger side of the motor. If we have a look over here, again, both throttle bodies will need to be disconnected, the hoses that lead to them, and again, I recommend removing the air boxes as well. If you look inside, there's 1 and 2 breather hoses. Actually, there's a third one over there. Small breather hoses need to get disconnected. And while you're here as well, one of the things you'll really want to check is there's a coolant line that runs over here. And this coolant line, I can tell you on my car, for instance, if I bent it with my fingers, it broke in pieces as it came off. My car is very well documented, good service, all of that kind of stuff, but just due to heat and age, this hose absolutely crumbled in my fingers. So you'll want to make sure that this hose is well taken care of. And don't just believe the way it looks on the outside. You'll want to bend it and really check its pliability, because the cloth will hide cracks underneath. It was really amazing. Couldn't believe the way it broke apart. I was actually amazed that it didn't fail on me on the road. And again, passenger side of the motor, not much else to disconnect. We're going to look at a few other things that are more towards the front of the engine now. Looking at the front side of the engine, there are some more things to disconnect. As you can see here and here, there are two vacuum lines, and they're labeled, they're color coded, and even on the car they're color coded, so it's very easy to slip them off. Here's an important one. You have the two lines that go to the fuel injection rails. These need to be disconnected using two wrenches, one that will hold the fitting and then one that will connect to the other fitting, and just unscrew it. They're not hugely tight, but they need to be taken off, and you want to make sure that you have a rag or something underneath, because gasoline will dribble out. And there is also a return line, here we are, a return line that goes on the right side of the car for the fuel system, again, that you want to disconnect when pulling the motor out. Again, more ground strap connections here on the engine. And one of the other important ones that we have is here we have the reinforced line. We covered this in another video, but this is the line that goes right next to where the coolant bottle is. It almost looks like it goes to the coolant bottle. It's actually next to the coolant bottle. And of course, we covered that in another video, how that needs to be replaced. So while we're at it as well, let's work our way forwards on the gearbox. And on the gearbox, on the front side of the gearbox, there is a wire connector that needs to be taken out. There is a sub-assembly with 4 bolts that grab onto the chassis on the underside. And then you go on the inside of the car and you disconnect the shift knob. There's this little plastic cover here to keep the threads clean. But you unscrew the shift knob, and there's a small other cover here that can be removed as well. It's not necessary, but that allows the gearbox to come out. So as you can see, not a lot of pieces involved in taking the engine out, or rather, there's not a lot extra to be done when removing the transmission. But it saves you a lot of time fiddling around trying to get these bell housing bolts off and anything else that's sort of related to that. If we walk back to the car, we'll just look at the last things that need to come out. You'll see that these covers and lights are off. That is not in any way related to pulling the motor out. Those are just a few other little service items that we did. So one of the things that we didn't cover yet are those big circular things on either side. Now those are the main motor mounts. They are on either side of the engine, and they're nothing more than a bolt that comes from underneath up and screws into the motor mount. So if we walk back over to the engine and we have a look underneath, where are you? There you go. There's the motor mount right there. Very, very straightforward. And one of the things you'll want to note as well is that the motor mounts have 2 large washers. They're not present at the moment, but there's 2 large washers that go on top of the motor mounts. And you want to make sure that you put those back when the engine goes back in. Other than that, looking in the engine bay, you want to pull most of the panels out. And there's a forward panel over here as well. Very easy to get to, but you're removing the forward part of the roof. That comes off, and it makes an enormous difference to the amount of access. It's also probably the best opportunity you'll ever have in your life to clean the rear windshield as well. And that covers most of it. In addition, I'm just noticing right now that there's a couple of extra vapor and breather lines near the front side of the motor I didn't cover. But that basically gives you the feel for what's required in order to get the engine out of one of these cars. It's not hugely time consuming. And I would say that you're probably looking in and around 1 day's labor to pull the engine out of one of these cars. So, give yourself 8 to 10 hours, and that should be all the time that you need. Another point to cover is, how do you lift the engine out of one of these cars? It's a very long assembly. This is about 7 feet long, actually. I haven't weighed it yet. I'm going to weigh it a little bit later. But it's almost 7 feet long. And from the factory, on both sides of the engine, there is 1, 2, and then same on the other side, hooks that you can use to grab the motor. Now, looking at some photographs and some videos from the factory, I decided to make a mount, a cradle, to pull the engine out. Very, very straightforward. And what I did was I used a combination of commercially available load leveler and a few pieces of 1x1 square stock. So the spread between the two of them, let's have a look here, is about 19-20 inches. I used the width of the load leveler to determine that length for me. And then my width, in this particular case, I went with 24 inches. Experience has taught me if I would have gone to 30, it would have given me a little bit better clearance to the throttle bodies. And that allows you a setup like this. And as you can see, I just welded some hooks to the end of it. A setup like this gives you fantastic control because it allows you to change the tip of the engine any way you like. It really helps a lot with putting the engine in and out of the car. And the fact is that the time it took me to make this was definitely less than the time I would have spent wrestling doing the engine and the gearbox separate. So you build one of these, and even if you're at exactly the same for time, it makes it much, much easier to pull the whole assembly out.
Inside my car, I got pictures, got candy, I'm a lovable man, and I can take you to the nearest star. I'm your vehicle, baby, I'll take you anywhere you want to go.
With the drivetrain reinstalled, we can look at some of the other things that need to be disconnected when you're actually removing or putting the engine in. So these two hoses right here are the ones that go to the oil sump. So definitely hoses that need to be disconnected. One thing I didn't cover when walking around the engine is this wire right up here. It's just covering a nut, an M8 nut, 13 millimeter wrench to disconnect the starter. And the important thing here is you only disconnect the one nut. You don't worry about the screw that's next to it because that one is covered by this connector that's right over there. And again, looking up a little bit here, there we are. There's the line for the clutch. Again, not a big deal to disconnect it right there because if you follow it over to the chassis, it's a little bit more difficult to remove it from over there. Other than that, this is pretty well, most of the stuff underneath. I guess one of the other things we can cover are the main motor mounts, really, really big. I mean, you can't miss those, one on either side. And those are among the large things that need to get disconnected. Let's look around the top of the motor and just look at a few more things. Looking back in the engine compartment, we can see the engine is back in. Most of the connections, but not all of them, have been made. And we can have a look at a few of the things that we discussed with the engine out. Looking at the very back here, you can see how the sway bar really does get in the way of the rear differential when trying to remove the engine. So the sway bar really does have to come out. And so does the mount on either side. And it's a two-piece mount. It's bolted to the chassis, and there are a number of shims. You just want to note the number that come off. You'll also notice that the handbrake assembly here has been reconnected, but a little piece of green tape to indicate that we haven't yet tightened it all up. Just a reminder. And as discussed before, the handbrake assembly passes through this mount, which is why it needs to be disconnected in the first place. Another thing to look at back here is that with the exhaust and the cooling tubes out, there's a large cross member over here. And that cross member, of course, needs to come out to take the engine out. And it's quite simple. There's 3 bolts, one there, one back there, and one up here. The top ones are accessed from the wheel wells coming in this direction. And you take that out, and again, there's washers that kind of space everything out. And it's just good to note what has come out over there. Besides that, there's just a number of connections. I mean, all the electrical connections have been redone. And you always want to pay close attention to the routing of the wires and the hoses. In a lot of places, it'll come close to maybe the heads, the cam covers, other locations, and you want to do your best to make sure that nothing ever touches. Even a tiny little air gap makes an enormous difference to the amount of heat that's transferred. Looking forwards a little bit, you'll notice that there's an air box on the left side. And again, I've always spoken about the value in taking the air boxes out. You can imagine that area right in the front there. You have almost no access when the airbox is in. It's only 3 bolts at that stage. You just pull it right out. On the passenger side, you'll see how much space there is when the airboxes are out. We're going to work our way forwards a little bit as well. I'll get the camera in here. And you'll notice that the coolant bottle is not currently installed. It normally go over these 2 fuel filters. And at 30,000 miles, I decided to change the fuel filters. Very easy, just unscrew them, put new ones in. But if you have a car, both with mileage, but also the age as well, the insides of the fuel filters will deteriorate, and they can put particulates in the fuel that can clog up your fuel injectors. So if you don't have a record of your fuel filters being changed, now is probably not a bad time. Same time as well, the very front here, we can see that hose. That's the hose that we spoke about in the other video, the one that pops on all the Murcielagos. And if you find our other video on our page, you can also find the part numbers and everything that's involved in replacing that. In this particular case, we went to a 4-layer silicone hose, much stronger, with more heat shielding. And you can see with the proximity to the exhaust, there's no surprise that those things pop as often as they do. Other than that, we're looking at the fuel lines here that would eventually connect to the fuel filters. And I found that when we put the engine back in, it was much easier to connect it on the engine side first with the engine out, and then leave these out. Much easier to make the connections over here rather than trying to reach over to the front. Just moving back as well, I'll kind of look at show you the car as a whole. And you'll see that we've covered it all with some protective mats. And one of the things we do use is we use yoga mats. They're cheap, they're inexpensive. They're really good for protecting the paint, and they also have just a slight bit of stickiness to them. And that stickiness makes a big difference to them not sliding or falling off the car. Also, when you do this work, good idea not to be wearing jeans, a belt, anything that could mar the paint. Things like track pants are a good idea because you're going to be doing a lot of leaning over.
You scratched my car. It's the rivet in my pants. These are cool pants too.
So that pretty well covers everything that's involved, well, hopefully everything that's involved in putting the engine in and out of one of these cars. Hopefully you've learned a few tips along the way, and hope to see you again in the garage. Thanks for joining me.